There are a lot of positive things to say about Dishonored. It has a fantastic world, great mission design, for the most part, layers of systemic interaction that seem to produce a near-endless stream of emergent gameplay, plus a neat range of abilities and gadgets players can get their teeth stuck into, and it offers a versatile stealth-based experience. Nevertheless, something about this particular stealth game has bothered me for the past few years. Dishonored draws a lot of its ideas from earlier immersive stealth games, specifically the Thief and Deus Ex series. Using a first-person perspective, these games throw players into industrial fantasy worlds that are at once similar to, and yet so very much beyond our own. We take on the role of a lone protagonist who infiltrates key locations, uncovers dark secrets, and traces conspiracies to their points of origin. Dishonored broadly follows this narrative template. We play as the royal bodyguard Corvo Attano, whose charges the Empress and her daughter are assassinated and abducted respectively. Dishonored's story centres on Corvo as he tracks down the villains responsible and dismantles their plans. Sounds like a feasible narrative, right? A touch cliched perhaps, but otherwise it sits comfortably in this weird Victorian steampunk fantasy world Arkane Studios created. So, what's the problem I have here? In my opinion, Dishonored forgot something that makes the Thief and Deus Ex games truly memorable. Having a well-crafted protagonist with a voice. A character who was, in and of themselves, an interesting persona to adopt within the rich stealth game spaces and narratives that Dishonored offers us. But Corvo Attano, our sneaky protagonist in Dishonored, is the playable character who should never have been the playable character. Here's why. While I've often talked about how the inner gameplay mechanisms of a stealth game can form a big part of the experience, I've also argued that there's a narrative component. The stealth-based nature of the game's protagonist. Players inhabit the virtual bodies of thieves, covert operatives, spies, escaping prisoners, assassins, and other rogues whose tasks involve sneaking around with varying degrees of subtlety. In this respect, Corvo Attano is perfectly serviceable. He's a rogue element, an assassin who's out to punish those responsible for the death of a loved one. Corvo Attano may fit what I would describe as the narratological trends of the stealth genre, which I've talked about in a previous video, but this alone doesn't make him a good fit for Dishonored's particular brand of narrative. To understand why Corvo Attano is what I'd consider to be a failed protagonist, we're going to look at the narrative weighting of Dishonored, and see how this masked assassin stacks up against the rest of the game's story and narrative backdrop. I've listed some categories based on the broad narrative components I've found in previous immersive stealth games from the Thief and Deus Ex series. I'm going to talk a little bit about how Dishonored handles itself in these categories. Keep in mind that I'm not going to go into immense amounts of detail here, but hopefully you will see the problem emerge as I move from one category to the next. Then at the end of this section I'll circle back to the concept of narrative weighting and how Dishonored gets it wrong. I would argue that Arkane Studios designed a fascinating world, rich with potential stories to explore and places they could take us to. The Empire of the Isles is spread across several islands, each with its own culture and history. The era is one of rapidly advancing industry and scientific pursuits, but there's also a supernatural undercurrent, with witches and other practitioners of ancient magic implied to be going about their dark business. The story takes place in the imperial capital, Dunwall, during a plague epidemic that's proven to be so virulent that there's a serious risk it could wipe out most, if not all, of the city's inhabitants. Every mission in Dishonored is masterful in terms of how it describes the world through its architecture, its non-player characters' dialogue, and the various notes and journals left for us to discover. We see ordinary people, dead and alive, who have struggled and are struggling to come to terms with the fact of their existence during a time of crisis, which helps us to understand the wider context of key characters and scenarios we're engaging with. Just to give a few examples, the first real mission in Dishonored is the Abbey of the Everyman, where we learn about the Empire's dominant religion and witness the fervent brutality of its overseer stormtroopers as they preach against social freedoms, supposed magic users, and the mysterious entity known as the Outsider, which are all placed under the broad spectrum of heresy. The Abbey itself is a blocky giant of a building, symbolic of the Overseer's power and political status. Inside, if you manage to find a good hiding spot, there's a conversation in the main hall between one of the Overseers and a group of civilians who are asking him for advice on how to deal with their personal struggles or family members. This really helps cement the idea that the Abbey has been instrumental in keeping the city together despite the ongoing plague crisis.
For such a young lady is easy prey to the Outsider. If not already within his grasp, watch her carefully for signs of it.
Then there's the Golden Cat Brothel, where prostitutes eke out a living under the thumbs of rich nobles and crooked guards. We can see how close the city of Dunwall is edging towards the precipice as we pass through dilapidated apartments and thoroughfares, some of which are infested with rats and plague victims. Snippets of conversation and journals inside the brothel reveal a colourful mix of clients and the pressures on the women who are working there because they have nowhere else to turn to.
Did you think I was born a courtesan, Lord Pendleton? I was a clerk to Lord Estermont. Before.
Whatever happened to old Estermont?
The rats did. An old sewer line led under his office in Parliament, and one day it flooded, and they all came rushing out. They say the other lords barricaded him in to save themselves. The screams lasted hours. He begged and called them by name, but they let him die.
Kaldwin's Bridge is a choke point for the City Watch, who struggle to keep order, while the few remaining traders struggle to make a profit, and the destitute simply struggle to survive. Civilians are abducted and put to use as test subjects for the district's resident sociopath, whose wealthy sponsors are desperate for a cure to the plague that threatens their rule.
As for test subject 312, after the characteristic sloughing of the skin, she should be dead by mid-morning tomorrow.
The flooded district is rock bottom, the low point of Dunwall's gloomy backdrop, from where we look up and see the unbridled fear and cruelty the city has slipped into. Piles of corpses dumped without ceremony in a watery pit to be forgotten, a terrible future for the Empire of the Isles that's both sickening and a coarse reflection of actual, real-world epidemics humanity has suffered through in recent history. If players take a violent, tactless approach to the gameplay, they will find that the city becomes more susceptible to corruption. Plague victims and rats multiply. Guards disappear from the city streets and abandoned buildings become strongholds for the virus. I cannot emphasize enough how structurally brilliant this is when combined with the storytelling elements in the game spaces and the NPCs who dwell in them. The world building and lore of Dishonored is, in my opinion, very good indeed. Each mission chisels out a story arc for the city itself that quietly reflects the consequences of player choice, while charting Dunwall's gradual descent into madness, telling stories from the perspectives of its citizenry and building up the player's knowledge of the world around it.
That's going to cast a pall over the whole evening. I think I'm starting to enjoy myself.
Dishonored has a diverse cast of weirdos. Again, I'm not going to go through every single one, but here are a few of the standout characters players will almost definitely cross paths with. The Outsider. This ancient, powerful entity somehow manages to come across as both all-knowing and curious. He is fascinated by the impact certain individuals can have upon the wider course of history, and takes an active interest in their choices, despite apparently being certain of every possible outcome.
I can see all her tomorrows, and I know that either she dies tonight at your hand, or she'll live out her days, month after month, year after year, far away, even as her fine clothes wear into tatters and her silken hair gets dull and grey.
Slackjaw. an opportunist whose primary goals are to retain and expand the territory under his gang's control. He's quick-witted, calm, and willing to strike deals as long as he can make a profit.
See that? Slackjaw keeps a bargain, just as good as them men who run the city. Maybe a little better. You think about that.
Samuel Beechworth. Humble, streetwise, conscientious, and optimistic, Samuel's a keen servant for the cause against tyranny, preferring not to call the shots and instead quietly assist those he considers to be his superiors.
I'm not one to speak against my betters, mind you, but if anybody ever deserved their fate, it was those Pendletons.
Piero Joplin, a socially awkward genius who is more comfortable in an isolated workshop than in a crowded pub. His apparent lack of social skills are matched by a strong resentment he carries for certain intellectual peers. Trevor Pendleton, pompous, irritable, yet resigned to living in what he considers squalid conditions with the Dunwall resistance, he yearns more than anything else to be recognised for his political acumen and social status.
Yes, I'm aware of that. My brothers control the voting bloc for my family. I'm very much aware of that.
Again, how the player chooses to act in any given mission will have an impact on how these characters, and more besides, react to the protagonist. It's just a shame that Corvo never says a word to them, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's move on. Hyrum Burrows and Thaddeus Campbell, both political giants prior to their takeover of the Imperial capital, are despicable villains who are fun to hate. There's a great scene near the beginning of the game where they're torturing Corvo and trying to convince him to falsely confess to the planned assassination of the Empress and the abduction of her daughter. Outside of that, there's plenty to say about Burrows and Campbell, their respective control complexes, paranoia, and hypocrisy. What I really appreciate about the build-up to going after Hyrum Burrows, the more dominant of the two villains, is that the player's actions determine how at ease Burrows is with his security arrangements. If players choose to avoid killing loads of people and frame or disappear key targets, including Campbell, Burrows chalks it up to a series of unfortunate coincidences. If players kill everyone along Corvo's road to vengeance, Burrows is rendered paranoid by the sudden bloodshed of his closest allies and locks himself up in a safe room. One antagonist who gets a bit left out is Dowd, leader of the assassins who actually killed the Empress and abducted her daughter, under contract for Hyrum Burrows. Dowd is one of the more interesting antagonists Corvo has to take on, as he too has been touched by the Outsider's gifts, and he's directly responsible for Burrows's and Campbell's takeover of Dunwall, and thus the current state of the city as well. Going toe-to-toe with this supernatural assassin and choosing whether to spare him or kill him is surprisingly impactful. The first time I played Dishonored, this encounter felt so rushed over the course of a single mission, the Flooded District, where there was a lot going on in terms of world building as well, that I couldn't help but think there was more to this character than we were being shown. Dowd is challenging to overcome in a straight-up fight in all the ways Burrows and Campbell are not. He's a ruthless opponent, yet he carries a sting of remorse over his actions at the beginning of the story, and he has nothing but contempt for his most recent employer, Hyrum Burrows.
Hyrum Burrows, you small, worried man. You'll never know how many times I've thought about trying to get close to you again, just to put a piece of sharp metal in your eye. But now there's no need. You've been taken down by the same apparatus that gave you life to begin with. Laws and courtrooms and the mighty swell of public outrage. Good riddance to you, sir.
We'll come back to Dowd later. Suffice to say, he's a physically threatening character whose powers put him on a level playing field with Corvo, and his deeper understanding of the Outsider offers a further layer of mystery. In short, the primary villains of Dishonored are all believable, rounded characters, and they sit well in the game's story. If you've played Dishonored, I want to give you a little challenge. Pause this video and tell me anything you can about Corvo Attano's personality, based on things you learned directly from Dishonored, the video game. By the way, I'm not talking about Corvo's job description, what he looks like, the relationships he has, the things that happen to him, or the things he does, and certainly not that iconic mask he wears. I'm talking about him. What's Corvo Attano like as a character? How does he react to the situations he finds himself in? What does he think of other people he meets? And what does that tell us about him as an individual? I bet you had trouble with that challenge. I know I did, and I've played through Dishonored several times. You would think I'd know something about its protagonist. Aside from the fact that he doesn't like being scolded, which, yeah, I don't think many of us do. I struggled to think of anything conclusive I could draw from Dishonored to describe this gentleman. When it comes to other characters in the game, as I've just demonstrated in the last few minutes, we have at least some basic personality traits to work with. Here, look, I'll talk about some of the ones I didn't mention before. Emily Kaldwin. Determined, precocious, full of curiosity and childish energy, she possesses an eagerness to explore the world, see the great whales, and possibly fight pirates.
I knew it! I read that some pirate ships have witches aboard that can cause storms and make whales do what they want. Is that true?
Granny Rags. Devoted to forces beyond the powers that govern Dunwall, she's a demented, playful predator who likes to present herself as the victim and has an unhealthy fixation on the outsider.
I just want to tell him I'm doing my part. Yes, Granny Rags is doing her part. Tell him, won't you, if you see him?
Admiral Havelock. Stern, pragmatic, proud, and morally flexible. An individual who sets his sights on his goals and doesn't relent until he reaches them. Anton Sokolov. Arrogant, intellectually brilliant, and disinterested in social concerns. His mind is everything to him, and he believes any sacrifice for scientific advancement is worth the outcome.
But the pain! Can't you give me something for the pain?
I do have many pain remedies, yes, but alas, I cannot give you any. They could interfere with my research. You should thank me. Soon we will have a cure for this terrible disease, thanks to all my hard work and dedication.
Corvo Attano. He's, a strong fighter? He has a mask. Okay. He seems to like Emily Kaldwin, and both she and her mother, the Empress, love him dearly. Do you see the problem yet? Corvo Attano isn't a character. If we hold Corvo up to other protagonists in stealth game history, characters like Garrett, Adam Jensen, JC Denton, Sam Fisher, Ricky Maru, Agent 47, Solid Snake, and Ezio Auditore, to name a few, Corvo is just bland. A blank slate. Now, I'm aware that this is a deliberate narrative design choice, one that I suspect was intended to allow players to form their own internal dialogue with Dishonored's story and gameplay systems. Play your way, as the marketing slogan goes. However, I'm going to argue that a silent protagonist, specifically in Dishonored's case, was the wrong choice for strong, consistent narrative design. I'm not claiming that all of these other characters would win BAFTA nominations for Best Writing or anything like that, but at least they have some colour, a degree of nuance to them we can see reflected in their game's respective story arcs. They are not at odds with the worlds in which players are expected to immerse themselves. Adam Jensen is cold and professional, Ezio is brash and passionate, Garrett is cynical and indifferent. Hell, even Agent 47, a stealth game protagonist who's literally a cloned super assassin, has a character we can work with. I could go on, but you get the idea. These are characters who we can, on some level, anchor ourselves to and empathise with, even if some of them are cold-hearted bastards. So let's go back to those categories I drew up for Dishonored's narrative. Here's roughly how long I spent describing Dishonored's narrative content within these categories. I haven't even covered these in complete detail, but there is a lot more to say for all of them, except for the protagonist, Corvo Attano, about whom there's comparatively little to say, because on a narrative level, there's nothing there. He's a paper-thin component of an otherwise deep and engaging narrative, supported by a diverse and fleshed-out cast of characters. This is narrative weighting. It is the amount of potential detail contained within specific narrative components of any given video game. It's not essential for developers to create a narrative for their games that's massively detailed. Nevertheless, we can appreciate that there is a balance to aim for here. Arkane Studios were so preoccupied with allowing us to play our way that they forgot to allow Corvo to tell his story, after having set up the game to be about his story. Corvo is little more than an avatar through which the player can express themselves to Dishonored's interwoven systems, so there is a high degree of gameplay action and consequence, but we can't know how the character behind that lovely, iconic mask feels about the player's choices, because he has no character. The balance of the narrative weighting is noticeably skewed. Now, let it not be said that silent protagonists are bad aspects of stealth game narrative design. That's nonsense. Like all things, they can work, and there are stealth games out there that use silent protagonists to good effect. So you might ask why I'm arguing that Dishonored's use of the silent protagonist is a bad narrative design choice, when it's a feature many of us wouldn't care to notice in other games. Well, using a named player character who has a unique position in a complex narrative backdrop, and who is also presumably motivated to do the things they're going to do, is arguably the wrong way to frame a silent protagonist. Players are, for lack of a better word, inhabiting this character from the outset, and our choices are supposed to matter not just in terms of how the world, gameplay or story responds to us, but in how our protagonist traverses their own personal arc. By not giving Corvo some modicum of personality, Arkane Studios asked players to do more than play their way. They asked us to decide how Corvo felt about our choices, what he might have said to many, if not all of the characters he interacted with, and what he might have thought about events unfolding before him. This is best reflected in the few dialogue options you get with actual characters in the game. Play hide and seek with Emily, or go and talk to the Empress straight away. Let Emily sleep in Corvo's room, or tell her to get lost. Admonish Piero when he's spying on Callista taking a bath, or don't. Proposition Callista when she's in the bath, or apologise for intruding, even though you already knew she was in there trying to bathe, you disgusting pervert. Make a deal with Slackjaw to quietly eliminate Corvo's targets in exchange for a safe combination, or tell him you'll kill them yourself. Seriously, is that supposed to be a moral choice? These interactions give players nice degrees of insight into the characters around Corvo, but what does Corvo think about all these decisions? Who knows? Players are expected to fill in the blank page that is Corvo's personality and identify with a character they essentially create themselves, as he stabs, chokes, and sneaks his way across Dunwall. We are asked to hold up a significant chunk of the ludonarrative experience, because the narrative part of that equation, the protagonist, was never built into anything but a dominant physical presence in the game space. We want Corvo's story. All we get is what it's like to play as him. And sure, many of us can do that if we choose to. Dishonored's stealth-based systems and narrative backdrop are definitely compelling enough for me to overlook the fact that I'm driving a brain-dead assassin to the gates of victory. I project my moral reasoning and some of my less virtuous characteristics onto Corvo, depending on whether I want to take a violent or subtle approach to the game spaces. But filling in those gaps presented by Corvo's character, or lack thereof, is a mental chore, and it's taken its toll on me as I've revisited this otherwise excellent stealth game. Dishonored's introduction sequence demonstrates the scale of the problem. It's a fine introduction as far as story setup goes. We meet several key characters, and antagonists, we get some insight into the issues troubling the Imperial capital, and establish Corvo's apparently close relationship with the Empress and her daughter, Emily. But Corvo's silence throughout is deafening. Just a few lines of spoken dialogue, or even Corvo's thoughts as an inner monologue, would have done more to immerse us in the role of Arkane Studios' chosen protagonist. Corvo is the character we're tied to throughout the game, so his insider knowledge on the world we're stepping into and the people we're meeting are potentially interesting and informative points of reference. Is he anxious about returning to the Empress with nothing but bad news? What does he think of Emily and how she's changed, or not changed, since the day he departed on his long voyage? Has Dunwall Tower changed much with its use of Sokolov's rapidly progressing technology? How does Corvo feel about the presence of High Overseer Campbell, Anton Sokolov, or the Spy Master Hyrum Burrows, as he goes to meet the Empress? You might argue that this is all irrelevant, that it's about how the player feels, not the protagonist, and you're right. Players benefit from having a protagonist they can connect with, someone who can ask questions for us or indeed provide answers and shed contextual light on the scenarios we're engaging with. It helps if the character themselves is someone who's a bit out of their depth with what's going on and has to come to terms with a shift in their personal circumstances. Say, a bodyguard who returns home to a difficult political situation and then fails to fend off an assassination and kidnap attempt on his charges. Basically, a functional protagonist is the audience's entry point into a complex narrative, and in a game like Dishonored, which, as I've already described, has a detailed world and a multitude of well-rounded characters and villains holding up its main story arc, a voiced protagonist with a personality and opinions of their own is pretty damned important. This narrative entry point narrows if the protagonist your audience is following has no voice. Players can pick up on the basics, like the tenderness with which Corvo interacts with Emily and the Empress, but we cannot connect on emotionally complex levels with a character who is incapable of expressing emotions. Just imagine how much more impactful this action-filled sequence would be if Corvo could express something. Anything, as a gang of magic-wielding assassins try to get to the Empress and her daughter while we're fighting them off. Or at the critical moment when Dowd finally succeeds where his men failed and plunges a blade into the Empress, as Corvo looks on helplessly. What about when he's thrown into prison and left to rot by the conspirators? What must be going through his mind at these critical moments in the game's introduction? Nope. Things happen to strangers we have seconds to form a non-verbal emotional bond with, and we are suddenly expected to care about them on Corvo's behalf, because he sure as hell can't. The player has to supply Corvo's character themselves, without any real sense of who he is, or why he should care. And that's a huge leap to make so early in the game, when players are looking to be invested in both the world and their protagonist. Narrative-wise, the other characters and the world are doing all the heavy lifting in Dishonored's introduction. It competently frames the backdrop of a city in crisis, sets up the major antagonists we'll later be expected to bring down, and has a wider sense of mystery through the inclusion of killers who can literally vanish into thin air. When it comes to Corvo Attano, the character we will be spending most of our time with, Arkane Studios have a damsel in distress and a dead love interest to engage us, hoping we don't notice that Corvo has had his vocal cords removed. It's lazy, and I personally find it hard to overlook this laziness when so much effort has been put into every other aspect of the narrative.
We have our best spies on it, but still no word on his identity. There are rumors he uses witchcraft.
He hides behind a mask and uses parlor tricks on the weak-minded.
If you're still not convinced that Corvo's lack of personality and Arkane Studios' over-reliance on players to give him one are major flaws in Dishonored's ludo-narrative, don't worry, I found something else that demonstrates the problem.
Just what were the canonical choices Corvo made in Dishonored, and did it change him? Your experiences have a big part into molding you into who you are, and Corvo has some weight on his shoulders.
This is King J. Grimm, talking about Corvo Attano and what he believes to be the accepted canon of Corvo's story arc in Dishonored. Among other things, this analysis includes the choices Corvo makes and why they matter to him as a character. It's a well-edited, thoroughly researched and thoughtful video. What I find interesting about Mr. Grimm's summary of Corvo's personality and choices is that almost every piece of evidence he gives comes from sources that are external to Dishonored. You know, the actual game in which Corvo is supposed to be a protagonist? Most of Mr. Grimm's conclusions are based on what lead designers tweeted, or what was written in a Reddit thread, a book or a graphic novel.
Evidence being a tweet by creative director of the game, Harvey Smith. Now luckily, the answer is actually in The Corroded Man, where Corvo reflects on that day, and he mentions that he indeed did play hide and seek with his daughter. As is shown alive in the book, The Corroded Man, we can come to this conclusion. The greatest evidence of this is again the great Harvey Smith. As in the book, there is a familiarity between the two men. Plus, the book does show that Corvo dislikes this method of getting information. Corvo knows that he needs to get rid of one of the Boyle sisters, and luckily, the book explains everything. There really wasn't anything that could give me answer to if Corvo killed Hyrum or not. But then, in the midst of my despair, Harvey Smith went on Reddit and wrote this. It is possible to live without the fight, but as the DLC shows us, Corvo does fight him. As the outsider, or as I like to call him, Harvey Smith, answered this tweet. In the book, that takes place over a decade after the game, Corvo still wonders if he made the right choice. Considering that Slackjaw is in the books, and that Harvey Smith has confirmed that Rags was indeed killed by Corvo, we know this, as again Harvey Smith tells us that Havelock was either killed or took suicide.
It's almost as if, in the game at least, Corvo Attano was a non-character, whom players had to project their own moral reasoning and personalities onto. Almost. Without all of that extra material, Mr. Grimm's analysis would have been, well, short if he was relying on the game alone. And that's the point. Who can say what Corvo's personality or choices are likely to have been, based on what we learn about him in Dishonored? One could argue that Corvo has good cause to lose his mind and massacre everyone. Or maybe he just kills his targets, avoiding detection like a professional bodyguard turned assassin. Maybe he's so haunted by the memory of the Empress lying dead in his arms that Corvo cannot bring himself to kill anyone else, and he just takes the non-lethal approach. Or maybe he's in it purely for revenge, Empress be damned. If you believe in the death of the author, it has to suck just a little bit that a protagonist and their choices have to be shown from beginning to end, not by the source material, but by Reddit posts, comics, a spin-off novel, and Twitter feeds. I guess we'll never know who thought it was a good idea to forego writing a major component of Dishonored's story into the actual game. Maybe it was more important to hire a bunch of known Hollywood actors for all of these characters and, alternate street speaker? Honestly, I thought Arkane Studios had failed miserably to create a protagonist as intriguing as those I've come across in other major stealth game franchises. And then, months after Dishonored was released, something happened.
One more job shouldn't have mattered. I'd killed nobles before. You could float a whaling ship on the high-born blood I've spilled. Another noble steps in to replace the last one. All equally corrupt. Why should an empress be different? But she was.
Arkane Studios released 3 downloadable pieces of content for Dishonored. One of these, the Dunwall City Trials, is absolute garbage. Don't play it. It's a glorified obstacle course with none of the personality. Seriously, I love this game on a mechanical level, but creating a series of challenges without plot or context was just stupid. Then there are the 2 pieces of story-driven content that were released afterwards, The Knife of Dunwall and The Brigmore Witches. These episodes give players 6 additional missions to complete, and they have everything that makes Dishonored worth playing. The open, vertical mission structures, the world building, a cast of intriguing characters and villains, even more wackier gadgets and abilities. They also fix the protagonist issues that hamstrung the narrative in the main game. Dowd is the protagonist in these episodes. You remember him, the magic-wielding assassin who killed the Empress and in so doing sent Dunwall careening into its downward spiral of decay? It turns out that being paid to kill benevolent rulers isn't all it's cracked up to be, and Dowd is experiencing something he hasn't felt in a long time. Remorse. Conflict over a job well done. Over the course of several missions, players uncover the secrets of a powerful witch, Delilah, who, like Corvo Attano and Dowd, is marked by the outsider. Delilah plots to take control of the Empire, using her considerable talents with black magic.
I ought to just kill you. I'm going to give you a warning for the sake of my sisters. They were very impressed with you once upon a time. Stay away from me.
I don't want to spoil too many details, but this story is intrinsically linked with Dowd's actions at the beginning of Dishonored. It's fascinating to watch as he squirms over his guilt and the potentially deadly fate that awaits him and his followers, even as he works to clean some of the blood from his hands. Dowd is an actual character, with a palpable motivation, a voice, and a personality that fit his role as a seasoned assassin. He's more in line with the kind of stealth game protagonists we've seen before than Corvo ever was. None of these guys are what we'd consider to be nice people. You wouldn't want to mess around with them, but they're not outright bastards either. That being said, Dowd's personality lands much further towards the darkness than the light, and his history and abilities as a magic-wielding assassin complement this aspect of his character.
You know, I could put you in Rothwild's interrogation chair myself. Why should I bargain with you?
Because it's a long and messy solution. And I'm gambling you're not the kind of man who likes that.
Half the city wants him dead. We'll earn some gold on this one. I'll meet you up ahead.
Dowd. Ever vigilant, I see. Are we leaving soon to Brigmore?
Interesting times, gentlemen. Overseers in the flooded district. Witches abroad in the city. Traitors in the ranks. I'd be nervous too. Then I'd remember who killed the Empress in Dunwall Tower. And came out untouched.
Dowd is cold, detached, calculating, and ruthless, yet simultaneously remorseful, determined, and dishonored. Wait a minute. Was Dowd the character we were supposed to be playing as originally? No, he probably wasn't, but just hear me out on this. Who, between these two characters, is the incorrectly spelled title of this game more appropriate for? Corvo Attano is, ultimately, a patsy who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He failed in his duties as a bodyguard in the face of overwhelming odds, but does that dishonour him? I mean, throughout the game he's trying to take down the people responsible for the Empress's death and protect her daughter, so he's technically following her last orders.
Find Emily. Protect her. You're the only one. You'll know what to do. Won't you? Corvo?
Personally, I think that sounds quite honourable. Oh my god. Guys? I think I found a personality trait here. Now let's turn to Dowd. Dowd is a rogue thug, a criminal haunting the flooded district and taking coin for the business of murder. Something troubles him about his success in killing the Empress of the Isles. He senses a change within himself, despite the fact that he has, by his own admission, spilled enough blood to float a whaling ship. In his dreams he meets the outsider, the avatar of the void from whom he and Corvo draw their powers, who tells him,
"The Empress was different. This time, you can't just fade away into the shadows. There will be consequences."
And so Dowd sets about the task of trying to make amends, even though he recognises that he is already beyond redemption for his crimes. I think we all know who is truly dishonoured between these two characters. based on their backstories alone. Regardless, as a protagonist in Dishonored's downloadable content episodes, Dowd is infinitely more interesting to play as than Corvo. He talks to NPCs and they know who he is by his reputation, so that forms an inherent power dynamic in conversations.
You're Dowd. Dowd. Shit, I hope you ain't here for me. I'm just a little fish in a big pond.
In particular, he has a strong working relationship with his apprentice, Billy Lurk, who comments on the decisions we make as Dowd, even to the extent of how destructive we are in general. Whether we kill a target, torture them for information, or simply knock them out and send them halfway across the world, Billy Lurk is by our side and takes note of our choices.
I'm still trying to figure out why you let the Empress's bodyguard go. And now Rothwild's snug in a box. What's got into you?
Dowd's role as Dunwall's most notorious assassin immediately tells us that he's comfortable with killing where necessary, but we get to decide how often he resorts to that practice. And this, at least in my opinion, fits Dishonored's Ludo narrative so much better than playing as an ambiguously psychotic bodyguard. Dowd talks about his missions before they begin, going over what he needs to do and the possible ways of getting it done. More than that, you get these little clues about his disposition towards other characters, including the Outsider, whom Dowd has known for much longer than Corvo, and as a direct result he seems to view this entity with a mixture of fear, distrust, and contempt.
He knew. The black-eyed bastard knew that when my blade stilled the Empress's heart and delivered her daughter to the Lord Regent's men, everything would fall to pieces. He watched me do it anyway. And now the world's gone mad.
There's a growing, palpable sense within Dowd's musings that his remaining time in Dunwall is short. He knows the results of his work are catching up to him, and he doesn't want his followers to suffer for it. He also doesn't think he's any better than Delilah, despite the fact that he's trying to put an end to her dark plans. As far as he's concerned, he has no more right to redemption than she has.
I know everything you can do, and it won't matter. 4 of us chosen, but history will only remember one. Delilah.
If they remember any of us.
Dowd could easily have been the playable character in the main game. How much more sense would it have made to start with Dowd's involvement in the protracted collapse of an empire and build an entire campaign around his attempts to mend the irreparable? The planned assassination of the Empress would have been a compelling introduction, where players had good reasons to use stealth, as opposed to an optional game of hide and seek, and there could have been some neat narrative elements where Dowd or his followers observed and maybe even heard conversations between the secondary characters present at Dunwall Tower, including Corvo, who would later emerge as a righteous agent of vengeance on Dowd's doorstep. Dowd questions his actions after the Empress's brutal murder, and we would have been right there with him, culpable, damned, dishonored. Sadly, it was not to be. But having Dowd as the protagonist in these downloadable episodes, and watching him deal with his remorse, engage with the world, and perhaps fulfill his desire to change his ways, was fantastic. If you found Corvo's complete lack of characterization irritating, and couldn't be bothered to see his story through to conclusion in the main game, I suggest you try Dowd's side of the coin. I maintain that Dishonored on its own is a good stealth game, but its ludonarrative impact is, again in my opinion, significantly reduced by the lack of a compelling protagonist. To Arkane Studios' credit, I believe they understood this problem, and fixed it with the Knife of Dunwall and the Brigmore Witches episodes. Dishonored and its DLC episodes are a testament to the importance of narrative components in stealth games. While getting it wrong can't break a competent stealth-based experience, that experience doesn't escape unblemished, and players notice this kind of thing. There are good reasons why these characters have endured in stealth game enthusiasts' minds. It's something that goes beyond competent game design. It proves that, in stealth games, the power of a compelling stealth-based protagonist is not to be scoffed at. I suspect that Dowd will be remembered by Dishonored fans for a long time to come. Corvo Attano's mask might be remembered too, but the character behind it? Unlikely. I know the title of this video is Why Dishonored Had to Fix Its Protagonist, but just in case you couldn't tell by this point, it's not entirely accurate. It's a lie. Because Arkane Studios didn't fix their protagonist, they replaced them wholesale with a character who demonstrably works better as a protagonist. Unlike Corvo, who's being ordered around by the actual characters in Dishonored's main story, it feels like Dowd is very much the architect of his own destiny. He kills a mother in front of her child, but tries to make amends for it. We make his choices along the way, he has his opinions about those choices, good or bad, and his character flows naturally into the narrative paths the player carves out for him in the game space. As a result, players stand a greater chance of being fully immersed in Dishonored's world. The truth is, there is no fixing Corvo Attano. He is a failure of stealth game narrative design, and the more I return to Dishonored, the more I become convinced that the real story can be found in its downloadable content. The main game is gradually reduced to window dressing. Tragic, but true. Corvo rides the inevitable revenge-driven wave of a victim of circumstance, while Dowd starts from a seemingly irredeemable moral position and claws his way through the filth of his sins to try to reclaim what remains of his lost honour. Perhaps he succeeds, and perhaps he doesn't. I guess that's up to any given player to decide. As soon as I finished the Brigmore Witches, I knew who I'd be more interested in seeing again for a sequel, but I also had a hope that Arkane Studios had learned their lesson. That we would get to play as a totally different kind of protagonist in Dishonored 2, someone with dirt on their hands who was living in the thick of this morally grey, magical, forbidden world, rather than looking down on it from on high. I mean, it would be ridiculous if Arkane had tried to do something asinine like fix Corvo Attano, right?